All right, everybody, welcome back. Our next speaker is Dr. Carolyn Neuhaus, a research scholar at the Hastings Center, where her work explores philosophical and ethical questions that arise throughout biomedical research and medical practice, ranging from the philosophical foundations of the use of animals in biomedical research to the development of digital medicine and the use of AI in healthcare. She's previously held the Rudin Postdoctoral Fellowship in the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU School of Medicine, and her research has appeared in JAMA, American Journal of Bioethics, and the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics, among other venues. Let's please welcome Dr. Neuhaus.
Thank you, Joel and Eric, and everyone, both here and online, and all of the thanks to the people in and not in this room who've made this possible. I'm Carolyn Neuhaus, and as Joel said, a research scholar at the Hastings Center. My training is in philosophy, and even more specifically in the analytic tradition. So I don't have as much facility in Foucault, and my comfort zone has long been conceptual analysis. Thankfully, now as a bioethicist, I'm exposed to a much wider range of methods and invited to use a lot of different kinds of methods. I think a testament to this conference is how many different disciplines are represented and can be brought together to study a particular topic. But for better or for worse, today I'll be doing conceptual analysis, but at least getting there by way of a story. And the concept is solidarity, and we'll connect very well to especially where Eva left us off before lunch. I should say I wasn't feeling so inclined to make PowerPoint slides, so sometimes I'll just have some artwork up. But I'm afraid now, after hearing Jessica's talk this morning, that my artwork will reveal just how entrenched colonialism is in my habitus. So that's, forgive me for a little bit, and something we can talk about, I'm sure. So my story that I'll get to solidarity through comes from March 2015, which was just a few weeks after President Obama announced the launch of the Precision Medicine Initiative that he promised would transform American healthcare. Shortly after this announcement, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy hosted a series of focus groups with a variety of parties about what this PMI might look like in practice. And so they convened focus groups of computer scientists, doctors, patients, patient advocates, bioethicists, et cetera. At the time, I was working as a research associate at the NYU Division of Medical Ethics, and my boss, Arthur Kaplan, was invited to one of these sessions, but he deferred the invitation to me. So I was terrified, but got to go down to DC to participate in a focus group of what this project could look like. So in early March, I got on the Amtrak train, and my anxiety, which was already quite high, just kept going up and up and up because my train was super delayed. So when I finally got there, rather than participate in the focus group of bioethicists, I participated in a focus group of patient advocates. So I still got to participate, which was cool. I did not see the president, but my groupies were a very different crew. But it turned out to be way more interesting, I think. There were only 4 other people, 2 parents of children with rare diseases and 2 people who had adult onset diseases. And all 4 of them felt that in some way genomic information. And for the parents of children with rare diseases, that was finding out a specific genetic mutation that could explain their children's physical and intellectual differences, even though they knew it wouldn't modify it. And importantly, as Eva said, led to creating a community that they otherwise would not have been tapped into. And for the people with adult onset diseases, the genomic information had led to actually finding treatments. I found the parent stories so compelling, and I'm sure all of you, now that Eva's story is top of mind, can relate. These 2 people, one a mother and the other a father, during this focus group recounted their diagnostic odyssey that they were on. Again, they knew not to really treat their child, but to understand their child's biological reality. how isolating and confusing it had been when doctors told them over the first few years of their child's life that they didn't know why their child was this way. Their elation when someone could pinpoint that this was what was causing your child's biological reality. But then this like sort of even more isolating feeling of being the only person with that mutation with very little support system. So what I sort of got from these stories was that these parents felt like they kept hitting walls. In order to understand their child's biology, they needed not only to know their own child's genome, but to know the genome of everyone else, so that we could understand the differences that might be causing this child's condition, but also to know who else in the world had this particular mutation. And so they were in this room arguing, really advocating that we need a project that will produce genetic information about everyone else so that I can understand my child. And they needed that data to be shareable so that other people around the globe had it and that they could know what was going on around the globe. These parents, I think, got that federally funded research projects had an appalling and shameful history of racial discrimination, exploitation, and injustice, but at the same time, they needed fellow humans to take part in this project so that they and their children and their families and future children and families didn't feel so alone. So on the one hand, their plea for a project like PMI was a beautiful manifestation of how interdependent we are in other people to realize anything in life, to provide for our physical needs, to educate us, to realize and experience agency, and yes, to produce knowledge that will treat or otherwise help our children. On the other hand, it was a manifestation of something uglier, using unwitting participants in a federally funded project as a means to an end that I wasn't really sure mattered. Whether the enormous financial cost of something like PMI, the weight it put on individuals to take part, or the social, economic, and political risks it would expose them to. I left utterly impressed. There I am in the executive office building. I left utterly impressed that these parents' ardent and unrelenting mission to do anything and everything for their children, but also feeling very confused and conflicted about my own role, or the role of any particular individual in research endeavors that would expose me to myriad risks, produce knowledge about myself that I didn't really want, make me liable for various forms of discrimination, create opportunities for new forms of biological racism, surveillance, and forensics. And really was this huge national undertaking, now renamed the All of Us Research Program, really going to help anyone anyway. So I could see how the knowledge produced would be a real gift to these families, but not so much for the tens of millions of other Americans whose disabilities are the result of unsafe housing, police brutality, unsafe neighborhoods, or unsafe drinking water. This experience made salient to me these questions. Do we all bear some weight in the production of genomic knowledge so that it might be a gift for families? What weight is too big? What gift is too small? And somewhat egotistically, I'll admit, I put the question to myself like this: why do I have to take part? Why do I have to help? And why do I have to help in this particular way by giving a biosample to a genomics research project? Let me keep it there for a second. That was like 4 years ago that these started swirling around, and I have yet to really systematically investigate them. So I want to again thank Joel and Eric for the push and opportunity. I already said I'll be doing some conceptual analysis, and I've decided to take as my primary conceptual framework for thinking about these questions that of solidarity. I've kind of cherry-picked this. You might ask, why not look at it through a lens of care or justice or feminist ethics or consequentialism? And my cheeky answer is because solidarity already involves all of those things. It's big enough. But my honest answer is that I just want to learn about solidarity. And this is because a few years ago, my friends and I co-founded a nonprofit organization that happens to be called the Solidarity Project. And we implement participatory development projects in Honduras. So much of what I've absorbed about solidarity in the meantime really comes from practice. And this paper is kind of my first attempt at getting a grip on the conceptual understanding, so bear with me. My interest is not just, this is a beautiful mural painted by an artist that we're partnering with in Honduras. My interest is not just personal. Solidarity's been getting a lot more play in bioethics literature as well, and I'll be citing and drawing on that in the remainder of my talk. The time just seems right, given how much play Solidarity's getting in a couple different circles to really think about what this concept means. So my working definition and the thesis that I'll defend is that solidarity involves recognizing another person or group as marginalized, oppressed, or suffering, and compels us to contribute to creating, reforming, and participating in institutions that are aimed at enhancing human flourishing. And we'll slowly unpack that over the next few minutes. It should be clear that I think Solidarity's reach extends way beyond genomics or international development or healthcare, but our context today is genomics, and I'm going to use that as sort of the lens for entry. In part because I think Solidarity is appealed to over and over again in genomics research in at least two different ways. So I'm going to discuss these two different ways in turn, and then see what we can understand about the concept by thinking through them. So the first is when solidarity is posited as the result of genomic research, which is to say genomic knowledge helps humans to recognize our connectedness. After all, we share about 99.9% of our genomes, we're told. So the argument goes, big genomics research projects enhance the sense in which we feel connected to each other, thereby enhancing solidarity, the moral fabric of a functioning democratic society. America needs solidarity right now and a functioning democracy more than ever, so we need genomics research to help us get there. I saw this argument at play recently in Anne Wojcicki's op-ed in the New York Times called "The Codes That Bind Us Set Us Apart." It was published shortly after 23andMe had offered its services to ICE to reconnect parents with children who had been ripped from their arms under orders from the American government. In it, Wojcicki expresses awe at how learning about our DNA reveals just how similar we are to each other and to other organisms. Magically, we are all formed from the same building blocks. She does not advance the stronger thesis that it's because we share genetic code that we stand in some sort of moral relationship, but does seem to imply that learning this information should have an effect on how we treat other humans, non-human animals, and the environment. So on this view, genetic information is almost a form of moral learning because it makes salient that we're all bound by DNA and prompts us to see others as similar to ourselves. My worry with this line of argumentation is what it implies about the concept of solidarity. It implies that solidarity is something that is discovered by recognizing ourselves in others rather than something that's created, that it's a static object that some analysis can help us get at, rather than something that comes and goes on the basis of what's inside people's minds. I think solidarity has a pretty complicated social ontology that I'm still trying to grapple with and unravel, but that it exists between and among people because we put ourselves in relation to others, not as some standing descriptive fact that always connects us. And what it means to sort of put ourselves in that relation is to recognize a particular person in need, to form an intention to promote that person or group's flourishing, and then to act in pursuit of their flourishing. And what I mean by need here is very much rooted in a sort of feminist conception of personhood. And the idea of persons is not needy in a sense of lacking, but that as a sort of fact about the human condition, that we're all interdependent creatures. So, smart. One might stand in solidarity without the object of one's intention realizing it, I think. So we could stand in solidarity with incarcerated persons or people who've lost their homes in natural disasters, or parents in NICUs around the world desperate to know what kind of life their children will lead. So in any of these cases, you might recognize the neediness, marginalization, oppression, suffering experienced by members of these groups, form an intention to regard them in a particular way, and importantly, act. So I think solidarity necessarily involves some sort of action. So that the stance or attitude that we take toward others is separable from the action that we also take, that we're compelled to take on the basis of that stance. Which is to say that there's a lot of actions that are materially equivalent to ones that we might take in solidarity, but that don't actually manifest solidarity because they're taken without this stance. So that's sort of doing nice things to get political notoriety. And we might also regard people in certain ways and not act. And I think that that is also a sort of failure to manifest solidarity. So we've learned solidarity is created, not discovered, and that creating solidarity involves the recognition of oppression, marginalization, or suffering, which I'm sort of terming need, as well as intention and action. I'm going to now turn to the other way in which solidarity is invoked in genomics research, and that's that solidarity is used over and over again to motivate participation, in particular in national genomics research projects. The most blatant example I could find of this is from a Norwegian study called MIDIA, which between 2001 and 2007 attempted to find the environmental causes of type 1 diabetes by identifying newborn babies who have a particular genetic mutation and then tracking them for a while. So pregnant mothers were given messaging that included this line: "Congratulations on the birth of a new citizen. It may seem early, but we would still like to invite you and your new little newborn citizen to make your first benevolent contribution to society." The contribution was, of course, a blood sample. And two Norwegian scholars in this great paper called "When is Normative Recruitment Legitimate?" argued that this kind of language was an illegitimate rhetorical advice, this appeal to citizenship to motivate participation. But we see the same rhetorical device over and over again. And I'm indebted to Jenny Reardon and Sandra Sujin Lee for giving lots of other examples of this that I won't go into. The only one that I'll mention is the All of Us research program, which is not quite explicit as the MIDIA project that's up there, but also appeals to a sort of sense of belonging and civic duty to participate. The idea that we're all in this together. And the efforts going toward creating a national research cohort that they take pains to note as a volunteer cohort, but the sense of national significance that they appeal to is, I think, more than implicit. The current ad campaign says the future of health begins with you, and tries to motivate all of us to participate in better care for all of us, both now and in the future. So these appeals seem to imply that participation in all of us in similar projects is something like a solidaristic practice. And I think that that's the case, I forgot to put that one up, under the definition of solidaristic practice, which has been advanced by Barbara Prainsack and Alina Books. I have no idea how to say this name. So I'm just going to call them PMB. But these two have been two of the most prolific writers on solidarity in the bioethics arena. And they define solidaristic practices as practices by which people or group accept costs to assist others with whom they recognize similarity in a relevant respect. So far, the All of Us research project seems to rely on a sense of national civic duty. We recognize ourselves in the other people in their ad campaigns, in the myriad stories of others who suffer from cancer, asthma, rare diseases, who are either helped or hope to be helped by precision medicine. The idea is to make an American cohort that I acknowledge that captures the diversity of this country, not one that's racially or ethnically defined. But as Jungst and colleagues have pointed out, its effort to empower every citizen to volunteer does not yield a suitably representative cohort the pressure to use people's group memberships to encourage participation could build. So we might see this group-based solidarity language being used to motivate, for example, African Americans to participate in the cohort to help other African Americans. And this language has already been used in some ethical appeals to a duty to participate in research. Rosamund Rhodes has pointed out that, quote, existing injustices can only be exacerbated by members of these groups refusing to participate in research. If your group does not participate in studies that assess health disparities, no one will know that health disparities of that sort, that of the sort that negatively affect you and your group exist. So Rhodes is here appealing to a sort of duty of beneficence to ground calls for group-based, so for example, African Americans, to participate in genomics research in order to help people like them. Although Rhodes does not use a solidarity framework to establish this duty to participate, she basically gets to the same place. We hear in her remarks appeals to solidaristic practices, as P and B say, practices by which people or groups accept willingness to accept costs of research participation to assist others with whom they recognized similarity in a relevant respect, in this case with respect to race. So whether that similarity is Americanness or a more group-based term, it seems to be that's the driving force of the solidaristic practice. They trace their notion of solidarity to Christian roots. So St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, stressed that community and fellowship among all human beings, the creatures that are made in God's likeness and image, are bound together by that trait. So like Thomas Aquinas and some other Christian theorists, P&B say that solidarity obtains among all humans, but also admit that it manifests in project-based groups, something like national biobanks, or other things where groups that see themselves as similar in some respect agree to take on costs to help each other. P&B do not specify a particular goal for solidaristic practices, only that the goal or the benefits pursued are shared, are sort of commonly held. So public health seems like a laudable enough goal. You might think something like higher wages or economic reform is too, but we can also imagine solidarity being appealed to in order to motivate much more nefarious goals like exorbitant wealth creation, fraud, white supremacy, or ableism. And there doesn't seem to be anything really caked into their definition of solidaristic practices that precludes solidarity legitimately being used in those contexts. So I think this is where their conception of solidarity is weakest. And in a recent paper, the philosopher Carol Gould argues that in this way, their conception of solidarity misses something really important about it, namely that it aims not at undefined shared interests or benefits, but rather at justice specifically. So according to Gould, one is not partaking in solidaristic practices if one is assisting others, even at personal cost, merely to produce benefits or pursue shared interests. So even granting that genomic information is a benefit that might assist people, I do not act in solidarity to produce it, according to Gould, if I don't also if I don't also aim at justice. And Gould's notion of solidarity is rooted not in the sort of Christian tradition, but in social justice movements like agrarian reform in Latin America and political movements against authoritarian regimes. And so with that sort of historical trajectory, aiming at justice is sort of a necessary component of solidaristic practice. For her, this means that justice is the protection of traditionally recognized negative liberties, as well as the availability of conditions that support people's self-developing activity over time. That is, the material and social conditions to self-develop. On top of welfare requirements like food, water, housing, she recognizes that self-development is an inherently social process involving other people. And importantly, it also requires freedom from domination and exploitation, both within interpersonal relationships and also in the institutions and systems that structure our lives. So that is why Gould then makes the next move, which says that aiming at solidarity and aiming at overcoming domination and exploitation also means countering and overcoming forms of structural injustice that amount to domination and exploitation. So this aiming is internal to solidarity. It's part of the conceptual meaning of it, rather than external to it, or just something that you might pursue through solidaristic practices, which seems to be allowed on P&B's view. Another thing Gould takes issue with in P&B's account is their focus on similarity as the basis for solidarity. It shouldn't won't be surprising that relevant similarities are not necessarily what's recognized on this sort of recognition-based view of solidarity. Although we do happen to share DNA, that's not what's recognized in recognizing another person as an interdependent, needy human. And this is so, and we especially recognize when we're in solidarity with people, needs and vulnerabilities that are the result of structural injustice, domination, and exploitation. So similarity as sort of a descriptive fact about people falls out of her account. That's not what's important for the creation of solidarity. I'm deeply indebted to Gould. I think her view is quite good already. And she was one of my graduate advisors, so I feel a special sense of affinity for it. But if I must put my own spin on it, I'm kind of toying with the idea that solidarity aims not only at justice, although I think that's important, but also at flourishing, and in particular, human flourishing in this context. So I think that aiming at justice maybe isn't enough. That Gould's conception of justice focuses on providing social and material conditions, or establishing social and material conditions for self-development. And she has in mind a variety of resources for her. But I want to be open and defend the idea that what it takes to achieve flourishing extends beyond social and material conditions to something like spiritual conditions. And without getting to like what my mom would call woo-woo, I want to also say that flourishing necessarily involves something like experiencing joy, creativity, and awe. And so communal experiences of joy and awe do not necessarily directly counter things like structural injustice that get in the way of flourishing, but it does speak to the resilience of the human spirit and sometimes constitute subversive acts and acts of resistance, as when we experience joy and creativity in the kinds of situations where that's not supposed to be the case. And this is something that I've come to understand really through my work with the Solidarity Project, where one of our guiding values is chispa, which means spark in Spanish, and is used to describe someone that has a contagious and life-giving energy and spirit. And in trying to manifest solidarity in a variety of circumstances, this chispa means that we bring to our work a striving for spaces where all members of the community can come together, not only to meet their basic needs, but also to dream, grow, thrive, and share creative energy. Gould might be inclined to accept that these kinds of considerations are part of justice and striving for self-development, but I'm not so sure. But I think that this human flourishing requires the same kinds of things that Gould has in mind in what we're aiming for in solidarity, which is aiming together for the social and material conditions to experience self-developing. But then on top of that, we're aiming for even more, which is something like human flourishing. So I started this section with the sort of appeals to solidarity in genomics research. But I think what we've learned in the meantime is that solidarity aims at something substantive, and this is again in contrast to what is kind of the reigning view in bioethics defended by Prainsack and B, and not merely that it just involves assisting people like us in pursuit of shared benefits or interests. And that, on my view, solidarity involves aiming at, in our actions, promoting human flourishing, and in that pursuit, countering structural injustice insofar as it gets in the way of human flourishing. And so we end up in the very place I said we would be, with a working definition that says that solidarity involves recognizing particular facets of persons, not necessarily that we're similar to them in a particular respect. And then this stance compels us to contributing to the creation, reformation, and participation in institutions that are aimed at enhancing flourishing. the question is now, in light of what I think is a fairly demanding conception of solidarity, whether appeals to our sense of civic duty in genomics research are legitimate appeals to solidarity. And is signing up the thing that I'm not sure I have to do, a manifestation of solidarity with people who require genomic information to, in various ways. And so I think the answer is it depends. With a defensible conception of solidarity, I think that this is now an empirical question, whether these appeals to solidarity-like things are legitimate. So I certainly believe families that tell me that genomic information gives them new avenues to understand themselves and to fight for recognition in a society that would otherwise erase them. And I think the creation of communities with genomic information as a political, now as a political organization to demand recognition and resources is an amazing way of using information that, again, could only be really produced through all of our participation in genomics research. So that seems to be sort of one area where I'm willing to see this information not just being used sort of to help people, but to also actually counter injustice in various ways. Moreover, projects like All of Us could do more than produce genomic information. It could be understood as sort of fancy epidemiological projects that are really aimed at health disparities. I think there's a sense in which one hopes the All of Us research project in particular could be that, and that would likely be a good thing and bring about various reforms that would counter injustice. But in all of these cases, it's not just the production of genomic knowledge that achieves justice. It's something more that has to be the case. So I think legitimate appeals to solidarity in motivating other people to participate in research must assume that there's this whole other infrastructure that's going to use the information in ways that actually counter structural injustice, in ways that are just, fair, and respectful. And if we're being honest, I think that infrastructure doesn't exist. The information will more likely than not be used in that way. It will instead be used to make already quite privileged people make their lives a little bit longer and a little bit better. And I think it's not that this doesn't matter, it does, and it's a really huge gift to give it. But I don't necessarily think that it's contributing to a solidaristic practice, just as in the way that I give my friends gifts is not necessarily a solidaristic practice. So there's lots of reasons we might give gifts, and not all of them, and actually I think not most of them, are because we stand in solidarity with the recipient of it. So I think I wouldn't be off the hook for doing all of the work that solidarity requires of me if I were to just sign up for the All of Us research project. And solidarity is much more demanding than that in what it requires of us in society to be in solidarity with, whether it's people with rare diseases that I met in that room or anyone else who we recognize as in need. So I'll stop there. Thank you, and I'll look forward to you helping me a lot.
Thanks for the great talk.
Oh, Joe, okay, sorry.
Back here. So I have a question about your definition of solidarity. I agree that we can't just sort of have a very thin, sort of content-neutral conception of solidarity in which it's just about identification with somebody else as far as common interests or something, and that it needs to have some kind of concern for justice and flourishing, some kind of moral content to it. But I wonder if your definition of solidarity still implies, to some degree anyway, some kind of identification with. The thinking that I have, sort of behind that worry is when you start off your definition, it says something along the lines of recognizing another person's oppression, right? In order to recognize another person's oppression, you have to recognize that person as a person, right? Yeah. As your moral equal. And so I'm wondering if just that in and of itself, that move, that cognitive move in and of itself is a variety of identification with them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think it's fair. One thing that I've been thinking about, and this is going to be a really roundabout way of answering, is whether we can be in solidarity with non-humans, which is a way, I think, of understanding what it is that we're recognizing in solidarity, and so, sort of as a conceptual problem. I think it might help clarify here. And I think that the answer is yes, that we can recognize even in non-human animals, like we can aim at the flourishing of non-human animals in solidarity, which would mean that what we're recognizing isn't common humanity necessarily, but specific ways in which that person is, or creature, is marginalized, oppressed, or otherwise suffering. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely wouldn't imply recognition of common humanity, of course, but it still could imply some kind of recognition of common something, right? Just sort of regarding that being as morally important and maybe to some extent your moral equal.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think that it's totally possible. Like that's probably likely. That's part of the recognition. But I think I still want to hold out hope that we're recognizing some further fact in addition. And maybe that's going to require routing through that, but I guess I'll play with it. Oh.
So, Carolyn, I want to just push you one step further.
Yeah.
And ask why you think that the definition needs necessarily to have the marginalized, oppressed piece to it. So wouldn't it be enough to just have the recognition of the moral status as opposed to having it be particularized?
It's a good question. Right now, my thinking is that it establishes the connection to countering structural injustice in ways that I think are important for the concept. So it's recognizing a particular kind of need that manifests because of unjust institutions. Can you put the definition back up? I can't. I flip-flopped. I'm not sure. That's the part that I want those words to highlight.
Doesn't the second part do that?
Maybe enough. Yeah. I'm torn. Because I think that it, again, involves recognizing more than just sameness, but a specific kind of need.
So the issue for me is that it seems rather one-sided, right? It seems like a pulling up, as opposed to, and it kind of negates, on the other side, the other person finding solidarity with you, right? And so it just does not have a mutuality that I think it could have. And it doesn't seem like you really need, in order to kind of champion a notion of solidarity and give it real power, to have that, that imbalance.
Okay.
Couldn't that element of recognition be the very possibility of the other flourishing?
Yeah. Okay. Can you say more?
Well, if you're aiming at flourishing, or perhaps a certain kind of flourishing, it doesn't make much sense to say that you stand in solidarity to someone who may not have the possibility of flourishing, right? So what you're doing is recognizing that as a being who has the possibility to flourish. I think this is where the sense that maybe you want the marginalized, but I agree with your point that you don't necessarily want to build in the imbalance, but it may be someone who's not if the good that you want to promote is flourishing, then you want to be able to recognize in the other someone who can flourish, but perhaps isn't. Right?
Yeah. I think Karen has a response.
One more try. So why do we think we're flourishing, right?
Oh, I don't, yeah.
I mean, so that, yeah,
Yeah, so maybe another go. This is seriously workshopping, like I'm really, really thankful. Is that, and we all experience need and like marginalization, oppression, suffering in different ways. So it's not to say, actually, maybe that's something that is the more reciprocal part of it. Totally. No, I'm on board with that. That there isn't actually a hierarchical thing, because the people who, like, when we stand in solidarity, we do so as equally, I mean, that's too strong, but as beings whose flourishing can also be thwarted in different ways by different kinds of structures all at the same time. So maybe it's that mutuality in the entering of the relationship that needs to be stronger.
Thanks for your presentation. You've given us a lot to think about. And just to sort of build on this conversation that's starting, I think that for me, I got stuck on that term, another. That's the part that I wondered if it was necessary to be there. And I immediately, this is a very particular kind of reference, but I immediately recalled Sherry Moraga's work. I don't know if you know Sherry Moraga, Latina feminist scholar, who in her essays, one of the things that she wrote about, and she wrote a lot about transracial feminist solidarity, was not being able to enter into that kind of relationship with other women from other groups until she had fully come to terms with the oppression within herself. And so there, for me, I immediately thought, well, also, what about that process of recognizing within oneself the damage that's been done to you in the systems of injustice that structure your life, which is just to say that this seems like one piece of a possible, like a multiplication, a refraction of all different kinds of experiences within a system. It's one piece of one kind of recognition among many others that might need to take place.
Yeah.
So that was just one thought that I had that maybe is helpful, maybe not. And then I also wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, to comment on the images that you chose. You mentioned them at the outset, and so of course I was sort of hyper fixated on them. And I think they also relate to this piece of the conversation, because of course so many of them are fraught with their own colonial context and dynamics of othering. And they also plug into this notion of flourishing that you're talking about. The language you used was, I've written it down somewhere. Joy, creativity, and awe. And so I was thinking about art and also the images within the art of dancing and holding hands, signaling that kind of flourishing, but within a context of colonial looking and art production. That was a long, rambling comment and
I
then
think
a question.
you already got
but
it. That's great.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, the images of dancing and are really salient to me for some reason in this context. And I think that is getting at that, like, we're not just trying to secure social and material conditions, but something further that people need need is too strong, but that this is not a cognitive process. I mean, I think the example of Sesha loving music and dance is a beautiful thing here, that it's not, there's more to being best you can be, whatever that is and whatever the circumstances are. Josie's jumping out of her seat.
I just want to ask about a different word in the definition. I mean, so hard to put up a new definition, right?
Yeah.
But it's the word institutions. So I thought for a while you were getting at acting and to enhance flourishing. So I got a little surprised to see participating in institutions, and I just wondered what that meant for you.
It can mean a lot of things. And I think institutions can be friendships, they can be professional associations, they can be healthcare systems. So I guess the institution for me connects to creating a collective that's more than one person. You don't act alone in aiming at flourishing, but that it happens in concert with others. Institution maybe is the wrong word to capture that.
You could have activities, participating in activities that are aimed, or I get
Yeah.
that. Of course, institutions can mean something really narrow and
Yeah,
pretty alienating. So I wasn't sure how you were using the word.
yeah.
So just to clarify, are you thinking of solidarity as something that everyone can participate in? Because my reading originally was also that solidarity on your account was something that the powerful do to the disenfranchised.
Oh,
But that's
God,
not what you're
no.
aiming for, is it?
No.
No, yeah.
That's a big.
So I think when you put the combination of like language like marginalised and oppressed and kind of structural injustice, I mean, my interpretation of structural injustice is that those are systems that disproportionately empower some at the expense of others. So then you're kind of getting that othering. Yeah. All right. Thank you for that clarification.
No, thank you. That's a really important point.
That was the last question. I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
Jokes.
So I'm just interested in your definition of solidarity again.
God.
And I'm interested in the way that you use a lot of verbs, acts like recognizing, contribute, participating. I'm interested because solidarity seems like a value, and by the way you've defined it, it's as if actions flow from a value. Whereas I'm interested in your comment, and I'm interested in maybe thinking about how maybe thinking about something like the principle of equal humanity, maybe thinking about how grounding values and actions, and maybe thinking about how actions flow from values in this definition, but maybe how we could anchor a definition of solidarity in something else like other principles or values, rather than simply like processes or actions.
You're going to have to teach me all about eco-humanism, is that what you said? Later. But yeah, I do think it's an action verb. I mean, I think that it's not merely a value, that it's not a principle, that solidarity is something that we make manifest. And it's interesting that you picked up on the action verbs. That's like revealing something to me that probably wasn't so transparent to myself. But that is something that I think is integral to the concept. So I wouldn't ground solidarity in some further principle, except perhaps some sort of notion of common humanity that we all share, which sort of, and I'm gonna have to think about this recognition of different kinds of things that might go into that. But so if there's a sort of prior thing, it's maybe some conception of humanity or need.